Soul price. Celine Ashworth had always been told never to speak a name carved in bone. But when she whispered it beneath the new moon, the torches died. The shadows stretched. The ground beneath her sighed, like something exhaling. And then he was there golden-eyed, watching her with something dark and knowing. "You have sealed the pact," he murmured, tilting his head. "And now, I am yours as much as you are mine." Chapter 1. The Whispering of Bone and Shadow. The air in the clearing hung thick and heavy, pregnant with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Autumn in Blackwood Hollow had always been a season of melancholic beauty, a time when the veil between worlds felt thin enough to pierce. Celine Ashworth, her silver hair braided loosely down her back, stood at the heart of the ancient stone circle, her breath misting in the frigid air. 62 years she had lived, most of them spent trying to outrun the whispers of her past, the legacy of her lineage. Tonight, she was running towards it. In her hand, she held a piece of bone, smooth and cold, etched with a name that had been forbidden to her since childhood. A name that tasted of rust and sorrow on her tongue. A name she now dared to whisper. "Nix," she breathed, the sound barely audible above the rustling of the wind through the skeletal branches of the surrounding trees. "Nix." She closed her eyes, bracing herself, remembering her grandmother's dire warnings. "Never speak a name carved in bone, Celine. It's a binding, a devouring pact. It will call what should remain lost." As the final syllable left her lips, the torches she had carefully placed around the circle flickered and died, plunging the clearing into a darkness so profound it felt like a physical presence. The shadows stretched, elongated and unnatural, reaching towards her like grasping claws. The ground beneath her feet sighed, a low, guttural exhalation that vibrated through her bones. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced the numbness that had settled in her heart years ago, a numbness she had cultivated as a shield. But beneath the fear, a flicker of something else, anticipation? Then he was there. He materialized from the darkness, as if woven from the shadows themselves. Tall and imposing, he stood at the edge of the circle, his form indistinct in the gloom. Only his eyes were clear, twin points of golden light that seemed to burn with an ancient, unsettling intensity. They held a knowing, a darkness that both terrified and captivated her. He tilted his head, a slight, almost questioning movement, and the moonlight, previously hidden by clouds, broke through, illuminating him in a stark, ethereal glow. He was magnificent and terrifying. His hair was the color of midnight, falling in thick waves around a face carved with sharp angles and planes. His features were both beautiful and severe, hinting at a power that lay dormant, barely contained. He wore clothes that seemed out of time, a dark, long coat over a simple tunic and trousers, the fabric hinting at both age and quality. But it was the aura that surrounded him, the palpable sense of ancient power that stole the air from Celine's lungs. "You have sealed the pact," he murmured, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very air around them. It was a voice that spoke of forgotten forests and moonlit hunts, of power and sorrow intertwined. "And now, I am yours as much as you are mine." Celine's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She wanted to speak, to demand answers, to scream at him to leave, but her voice was caught in her throat. The words of her grandmother echoed in her mind, devouring pact. What had she done? He took a step closer, the golden light in his eyes intensifying. The air crackled with an unseen energy, and Celine felt a strange pull, a magnetic force drawing her towards him. She fought against it, planting her feet firmly on the ground, her hands clenching into fists. Who are you?" she finally managed to whisper, her voice trembling. He smiled then, a slow, unsettling curve of his lips that revealed a hint of sharp, almost predatory teeth. "You know who I am, Celine Ashworth. You call my name." The name, Nyx. It felt different coming from his lips, imbued with a power and a history she couldn't comprehend. It resonated within her, awakening something deep and primal, something she had long suppressed. I don't understand, she stammered, her carefully constructed composure crumbling around her. She had spent years burying the supernatural part of her heritage, pretending it didn't exist. Now, confronted with the reality of it, she felt utterly lost. He moved closer still, his presence overwhelming, filling the space between them. She could smell him now, a wild, intoxicating scent of rain-soaked earth and pine needles, with an underlying hint of something metallic. It was a scent that triggered a deep, instinctive response within her, a mixture of fear and something else. Something she wouldn't name. You will, he said, his voice softening, losing some of its edge. In time, you will understand everything. He reached out a hand, his fingers long and elegant, and for a moment, Celine thought he was going to touch her. She flinched, bracing herself, but he stopped just short of making contact. His hand hovered in the air between them, a silent question, a silent offering. The pact is sealed, he repeated, his golden eyes searching hers, delving into the depths of her soul. We are bound, Celine. By blood, by magic, by fate. She stared at his hand, at the lines etched into his palm, lines that seemed to shift and change in the moonlight, like the branches of a restless tree. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that her life had irrevocably changed. The quiet, solitary existence she had carved out for herself was shattered. The whispers of her past had become a roar. And this man, this creature of shadow and moonlight, was at the center of it all. She felt a tear escape, tracing a cold path down her cheek. It was a tear not of fear, but of release, of surrender, of a strange, unsettling hope. She had spent so long running, hiding, denying. Now there was nowhere left to run. He lowered his hand, the unspoken question still hanging in the air between them. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the rustling of the wind and the frantic beat of Celine's heart. The moon, a silent witness, bathed them in its cold, ethereal light. What would happen now? Chapter 2. Echoes of a Forgotten Moon. The drive back to her cottage felt surreal, the headlights of her old Volvo cutting through a thick fog that had rolled in, seemingly out of nowhere. The world outside the car was muffled, indistinct, mirroring the turmoil within Celine's mind. Nix hadn't followed her, hadn't even spoken another word after his declaration of their binding. He had simply vanished, melting back into the shadows as if he were a part of them. But his presence lingered, a phantom weight in the passenger seat, a scent of rain and pine clinging to the upholstery. Her cottage, usually a sanctuary, felt alien tonight. The familiar creaks of the old wooden floorboards, the comforting tick of the grandfather clock in the hall, all seemed to hold a new, unsettling resonance. She moved through the rooms like a ghost, her reflection in the darkened windows a stranger staring back at her. She had activated an ancient ritual, called him forth. She poured herself a glass of wine, her hand trembling so badly that some of it sloshed over the rim. The rich, ruby liquid did little to calm the frantic flutter of her heart. She sat at her kitchen table, the boneless source of all this chaos lying before her, its smooth surface reflecting the dim light of the overhead lamp. It was a relic from her grandmother, Eleanor, a woman she had barely known, a woman shrouded in mystery and whispered warnings. Eleanor had died when Celine was just a child, but the stories had persisted. Stories of a woman who walked with shadows, who spoke to the moon, who held a power that both terrified and fascinated the small community of Blackwood Hollow. Stories Celine had dismissed as folklore, as the ramblings of superstitious villagers. Until tonight. She picked up the bone, its coldness seeping into her skin. The name, Nix, was carved with an artistry that belied its age, the letters flowing and elegant, yet imbued with a sense of ancient power. She traced the curves with her fingertip, feeling a faint vibration, a hum that resonated deep within her bones. A sudden, sharp rap at the door made her jump, her heart leaping into her throat. Wine splashed onto the table as she nearly dropped the glass. Who could be calling at this hour? Blackwood Hollow was not known for its late-night visitors. Hesitantly, she approached the door, peering through the peephole. Standing on her porch, bathed in the pale glow of the security light, was a young woman, no older than 20, her face pale and streaked with tears. She was clutching a small, leather-bound book to her chest. Celine cautiously opened the door, a sense of unease settling in her stomach. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice strained. The young woman looked up at her, her eyes wide and desperate. "Are you Celine Ashworth?" she asked, her voice trembling. Celine nodded slowly. "I am. My grandmother, she told me to find you," the young woman said, her voice choked with sobs. She said you would know what to do." She held out the book, her hand shaking. "She said this would explain everything." Celine took the book, her fingers brushing against the young woman's cold skin. The leather was worn and smooth, the pages yellowed with age. It felt familiar. As she looked closer, she noticed a small, silver clasp on the cover, shaped like a crescent moon. The same symbol that was etched onto the bone. "What's your name?" Celine asked, her voice softening. "Alara," the young woman replied, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "Alara Vance." Celine's breath caught in her throat. Vance. Another name whispered in the shadowed corners of Blackwood Hollow's history. A name linked to her own, to Eleanor's, to Nick's. "Come in, Alara," Celine said, stepping aside to allow the young woman to enter. "It seems we have much to discuss." As Alara stepped inside, Celine closed the door, shutting out the fog and the night, but not the sense of impending doom. The air in the cottage crackled with unseen energy, the echoes of a forgotten moon reverberating through the room. The grandfather clock chimed the hour, each strike a heavy, ominous note. Celine knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that Alara's arrival was no coincidence. It was another thread in the tapestry of fate, woven by the whispering of bone and shadow. And she, whether she liked it or not, was now inextricably caught in its intricate design. What secrets did the book hold, and why had Alara's grandmother sent her here, tonight of all nights? Chapter 3. The Scent of Rain and Pine. The fire Celine had built in the hearth crackled merrily, casting dancing shadows on the walls of the cozy living room. The scent of burning wood mingled with the lingering aroma of the herbal tea she had brewed for Alara, a calming blend of chamomile and lavender. Alara sat huddled on the sofa, wrapped in one of Celine's thickest blankets, the leather-bound book resting on her lap. She had stopped crying, but her eyes were still red-rimmed and filled with a deep, unsettling sadness. Celine sat opposite her in an armchair, studying the young woman with a mixture of concern and curiosity. Alara was a striking contrast to herself, a vibrant splash of youth against Celine's subdued, silver-toned presence. Alara's hair was a cascade of fiery red curls, her skin pale and freckled, her eyes a bright, almost startling green. There was a fragility about her, a vulnerability that tugged at Celine's heart. "Tell me about your grandmother, Alara," Celine said gently, her voice a low murmur against the backdrop of the crackling fire. Alara took a deep breath, her fingers tracing the crescent moon clasp on the book. "Her name was Moira," she said, her voice still thick with emotion. She died last week. Suddenly. "A heart attack," they said. Celine nodded, her own heart aching with a familiar pang of loss. The suddenness of death, the way it could snatch someone away without warning, was a pain she knew all too well. She had lost her husband, David, 20 years ago in a car accident, a loss that had left a gaping hole in her life, a wound that had never fully healed. "I'm so sorry, Alara," Celine said softly. Alara looked up at her, her green eyes filled with a glimmer of gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. She raised me, you know. My parents, they died when I was a baby. Moira was all I had." Celine felt a kinship with this young woman, a shared experience of loss and loneliness. It was a bond that transcended their age difference, a connection forged in the crucible of grief. "She told me stories," Alara continued, her voice gaining strength. "Stories about Blackwood Hollow, about the old families, about magic." She hesitated, glancing at Celine as if gauging her reaction. Celine smiled faintly. "I know those stories," she said. "My grandmother told me similar tales." Alara's eyes widened slightly. She said your family was special, that you had a gift." Celine's smile faded. The gift, as Alara called it, was a burden, a curse she had spent most of her life trying to suppress. The ability to sense things others couldn't, to see glimpses of the unseen world, to feel the echoes of past lives. It was a gift that had brought her more pain than joy. "It's not a gift, Alara," Celine said quietly. "It's a responsibility. A heavy one." Alara nodded slowly, her gaze dropping back to the book in her lap. Moira said this book would explain everything about the pact. About him. The pact. Him. Nyx. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Celine felt a shiver run down her spine, the scent of rain and pines suddenly filling her senses, even though the windows were closed and the fire was burning brightly. He was close. She could feel it. "What did she say about the pact?" Celine asked, her voice barely a whisper. Alara opened the book, her fingers trembling as she turned the fragile, yellowed pages. The script was elegant and flowing, written in a faded ink that spoke of a bygone era. She said it was an ancient agreement. Alara read aloud, her voice halting and uncertain. "Between two families, the Ashworths and the Nightshades. A pact forged in blood and moonlight to protect Blackwood Hollow from something dark. Something ancient. Nightshades." The name resonated with Celine, a whisper from the depths of her memory. She had heard it before, in her grandmother's stories, always spoken with a mixture of fear and reverence. "And him?" Celine prompted, her heart pounding in her chest. Alara turned another page, her eyes scanning the text. He is the guardian," she read. "The protector. Bound to the Ashworth line by the pact. He is called Nyx." Celine closed her eyes. The image of Nyx's golden eyes, his intense gaze, burned into her mind. The guardian. The protector. Bound to her. The weight of it all pressed down on her, suffocating her. "But there's more," Alara said, her voice filled with a growing sense of dread. "Moira said the pact is failing. The darkness, it's returning. And only the Ashworth heir can renew it." The Ashworth heir. That was her. Celine. The last of her line. The one who had whispered the forbidden name, who had sealed the pact, who was now bound to a creature of shadow and moonlight. She looked at Alara, at the fear and desperation in her young eyes. She looked at the book, at the ancient words that held the key to her destiny. And she knew, with a chilling certainty, that her life, her quiet, solitary existence was over. She had a responsibility, a duty, to protect Blackwood Hollow, to renew the pact, to face the darkness that was rising. And she had to do it with him. With Nyx. But a cold fear gripped Celine's heart. Could she possibly trust a creature born of shadow, and was she ready to pay the ancient price for the devouring pact? Chapter 4. A house with too many mirrors. The next morning dawned gray and overcast, the sky a heavy blanket of clouds that mirrored the weight in Celine's heart. Sleep had eluded her, her mind a whirlwind of fragmented memories, whispered warnings, and the unsettling image of Nyx's golden eyes. Alara had stayed the night, sleeping fitfully on the sofa, the leather-bound book clutched tightly in her hand. Celine made breakfast, a simple fare of toast and eggs, but neither of them had much of an appetite. The silence in the kitchen was thick with unspoken questions, with the shared knowledge of the immense task that lay ahead of them. After breakfast, they decided to delve deeper into Moira's book. They sat together at the kitchen table, the ancient text spread out between them like a map to a forgotten world. The pages were filled with not only text but also intricate drawings, diagrams of constellations, and sketches of strange, otherworldly creatures. "This is incredible," Alara whispered, her eyes wide with awe and apprehension. "I had no idea Moira knew so much." Celine nodded, her fingers tracing the outline of a drawing that depicted a wolf howling at a crescent moon. The image resonated with her, stirring something deep and primal within her. She had always felt a strange connection to wolves, a sense of kinship with their wild, untamed nature. As they continued to read, they discovered more details about the pact, about the Nightshade family, and about Nyx. The Nightshades, it turned out, were not human, at least not entirely. They were shapeshifters, able to transform into wolves at will, their power tied to the cycles of the moon. Nyx was their leader, their alpha, the strongest and most ancient of their kind. The pact, forged centuries ago, was a desperate attempt to contain a powerful, ancient entity that threatened to consume Blackwood Hollow and the surrounding lands. The Ashworths, with their unique ability to sense and manipulate the veil between worlds, had joined forces with the Nightshades, their combined power creating a barrier that had held the darkness at bay. But the pact was weakening. The book described a series of rituals, of sacrifices, that were required to maintain its strength. Rituals that had been neglected, forgotten, over the generations. Sacrifices that Celine was now expected to perform. "This is terrifying," Alara said, her voice trembling. "I don't know if I can do this." Celine looked at her, at the fear in her young eyes, and felt a surge of protectiveness. She had to be strong for both of them. "We'll do it together, Alara," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her heart. "We have to." A sudden knock at the door startled them both. Celine's heart leaped into her throat. She knew, instinctively, who it was. She opened the door, and there he stood. Nyx. He looked different in the daylight, less ethereal, more solid, but no less imposing. His dark hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail, revealing the sharp angles of his face, the intensity of his golden eyes. He wore jeans and a dark sweater, clothes that looked surprisingly ordinary on him, yet somehow still managed to hint at his otherworldly nature. "Celine," he said, his voice a low rumble that sent shivers down her spine. He didn't ask to come in, didn't need to. He simply stood there, his presence filling the doorway, filling the entire house. Celine stepped aside, her heart pounding against her ribs. "Nyx," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. He entered the cottage, his gaze sweeping over the room, taking in every detail. His eyes lingered on Alara, who was staring at him with a mixture of fear and fascination. "You brought a friend," he said, his voice laced with a hint of amusement. "This is Alara," Celine said, her voice regaining some of its strength. She's helping me." Nyx nodded slowly, his golden eyes never leaving Alara's face. "I see," he said. "Another descendant of the pact." Alara swallowed hard, her hands clutching the book tightly. "I know about the pact," she said, her voice trembling. "About you." Nyx smiled then, a slow, unsettling smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Good," he said. "Then you understand the gravity of the situation." He turned his attention back to Celine, his gaze intense and unwavering. "We have much to do," he said. "The darkness is stirring. The veil is thinning. We must prepare." Celine looked at him, at the ancient power that radiated from him, at the hint of vulnerability that flickered beneath his stoic facade. She knew she had no choice. She had to trust him. She had to follow him. She had to face the darkness with him. But as she looked around her familiar, now foreign-feeling cottage, she saw that the many mirrors reflected not just the room, but infinite, distorted versions of herself, Nyx, and Alara. An unsettling reminder of the fractured reality she now inhabited. Which reflection was the true one, and what path would that Celine choose? Chapter 5. The Dance of Dusk and Secrets. Nyx's presence transformed the cottage. It felt smaller, more confined, the air thick with an unspoken tension. He moved with a quiet grace, a predator in his natural habitat, his every gesture deliberate and purposeful. He examined Moira's book with a critical eye, his fingers tracing the ancient script with a familiarity that both intrigued and unnerved Celine. "This is incomplete," he said, his voice a low murmur. "There are pages missing, rituals omitted. Crucial information is lost." Celine frowned. "Missing? How is that possible?" Nyx looked up at her, his golden eyes piercing. The pact has been weakened not only by time, but by deliberate sabotage. Someone has been trying to erase the knowledge to prevent its renewal. Alara gasped. But who?
And why?
Nick shrugged, a subtle movement of his broad shoulders. That is what we must discover. There are those who would welcome the darkness, who believe it offers power, freedom from the constraints of the old ways. The thought sent a chill down Celine's spine. The idea that someone, perhaps someone within Blackwood Hollow, was actively working against them, was deeply unsettling. We need to find the missing pages, Celine said, her voice firm. We need to understand the full extent of the rituals. Nix nodded. We will start with Eleanor's belongings. Your grandmother was a keeper of secrets. She may have hidden the missing information. Eleanor's belongings were stored in the attic, a dusty, dimly lit space filled with forgotten treasures and the ghosts of the past. Celine hadn't ventured up there in years, the memories associated with it too painful to confront. But now, she had no choice. The attic was a labyrinth of boxes, trunks, and antique furniture draped in white sheets. The air was thick with the scent of dust and decay, a musty odor that tickled Celine's nose. Moonlight filtered through a single, grimy window, casting long, eerie shadows that danced across the floor. Nix moved through the attic with an effortless grace, his senses heightened, searching for any clue, any hint of the missing pages. He ran his fingers along the spines of old books, peered inside dusty boxes, his golden eyes gleaming in the dim light. Celine, meanwhile, felt a growing sense of unease. The attic was a repository of her family's history, a place where the past felt palpable, almost alive. She could almost hear the whispers of her ancestors, their voices echoing through the years. I don't like it up here, Alara whispered, her voice trembling. She was standing close to Celine, her hand clutching her arm. Celine squeezed her hand reassuringly. I know, she said. But we have to do this. As they searched, Celine stumbled upon a small, wooden chest tucked away in a dark corner. It was locked, but the key was hanging on a rusty nail nearby. She opened the chest, her heart pounding with anticipation. Inside, she found a collection of personal items, a silver locket containing a faded photograph of Eleanor, a dried flower pressed between the pages of a worn poetry book, a small, velvet pouch filled with smooth, gray stones. And beneath it all, a folded piece of parchment. Celine carefully unfolded the parchment, her hands trembling. It was a letter, written in Eleanor's elegant script, addressed to Celine. My dearest Celine, the letter began, if you are reading this, then the time has come. The pact is weakening, and you must be the one to renew it. I know this is a heavy burden, but you are strong, Celine. Stronger than you know. The letter went on to describe a specific ritual, a dance to be performed under the next full moon, a dance that would draw upon the power of the earth and the moon to strengthen the veil. The ritual required a specific location, a hidden grove deep within the Blackwood forest, a place where the veil was said to be particularly thin. But the letter also contained a warning. Beware, Celine, Eleanor wrote, for the darkness has its agents. They will try to stop you. Trust no one, except the one who is bound to you by the pact. He is your protector, your guide. But even he has secrets. Secrets that could break your heart. Secrets. The word echoed in Celine's mind. What secrets was Nix hiding? And could she truly trust him? This creature of shadow and moonlight, this man who is both her protector and a potential threat? As the dust motes swirled in the single shaft of moonlight and Alara shifted nervously beside her, Celine felt the weight of Eleanor's words pressed down with a suffocating force. The dance of dusk had begun. Chapter 6. Letters from a Ghost. The discovery of Eleanor's letter ignited a spark of determination within Celine. Despite the unsettling warning about Nix's secrets, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had a task, a ritual to perform, a responsibility to uphold. She wouldn't let fear paralyze her. We need to find this grove, Celine said, her voice firm, turning to Nix and Alara. The next full moon is in 3 days. We have to prepare. Nix nodded, his golden eyes studying the letter with an intensity that made Celine's skin prickle. I know the place, he said. It is a sacred place for my kind. A place of power. His words sent a shiver down Celine's spine. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Nix's connection to this grove than he was letting on. But she pushed her doubts aside. She had to focus on the task at hand. Over the next 2 days, they immersed themselves in preparations. Alara, using her knowledge of herbalism gleaned from Moira's book, began gathering the necessary ingredients for the ritual: rare herbs, specific types of wood, crystals that resonated with lunar energy. Celine, meanwhile, practiced the dance, her movements initially stiff and awkward, gradually becoming more fluid, more graceful, as she connected with the ancient rhythm described in Eleanor's letter. Nix, ever the watchful guardian, oversaw their preparations, offering guidance, correcting their mistakes, his presence a constant reminder of the supernatural world that now enveloped them. He taught Celine how to harness her own innate abilities, how to sense the subtle energies that flowed through the earth, how to draw upon the power of the moon. You have a strong connection to the earth, Celine, he said, his voice a low murmur as he watched her practice the dance in the moonlit clearing behind her cottage. You are a daughter of the Ashworth line. The power flows through you. Celine paused, her breath catching in her throat. She looked at him, at his intense gaze, at the hint of something almost like admiration in his eyes. She felt a strange pull towards him, a connection that defied logic, that transcended the fear and the uncertainty. Tell me about your secrets, Nix, she said, her voice barely a whisper. He went still, his golden eyes darkening. The air around them seemed to crackle with unspoken tension. There will be time for that later, Celine, he said, his voice guarded. Now, focus on the dance. Focus on the ritual. Celine wanted to press him, to demand answers, but she knew he wouldn't yield. He was a creature of shadows, of secrets, and he would reveal them only on his own terms. On the evening before the full moon, Celine found another letter from Eleanor, tucked inside the velvet pouch with the gray stones. This letter was shorter, more cryptic than the first. My dearest Celine, it read, the stones hold the key. They are a conduit to the other side. Use them wisely. But be warned, the path is fraught with peril. The closer you get to the truth, the greater the danger. Celine examined the stones, turning them over in her hand. They were smooth and cool to the touch, their gray surface unremarkable. But she could feel a faint vibration emanating from them, a subtle hum that resonated deep within her bones. What was their purpose? How were they connected to the ritual? She showed the letter and the stones to Nix, hoping for some explanation. He studied them carefully, his brow furrowed in concentration. These are moonstones, he said, his voice thoughtful. They are imbued with the energy of the moon. They can amplify your power, help you connect with the veil. But how do I use them? Celine asked. Nix hesitated, his golden eyes searching hers. There is a risk, he said. The moonstones can open a doorway to the other side, to the realm of the entity we are trying to contain. It is a dangerous path. Celine felt a chill run down her spine. The entity, the darkness. The thought of facing it directly was terrifying. But she also knew that she couldn't back down. She had to be willing to take the risk. I understand, she said, her voice firm. I'm ready. Nix looked at her, his gaze intense and unwavering. He seemed to be searching for something in her eyes, some assurance, some sign of her resolve. Very well, he said, his voice a low rumble. But be warned, Celine. The other side is not a place for the faint of heart. It will test you, challenge you, in ways you cannot imagine. The weight of the task ahead had only just begun to settle. What was the other side, and what was this entity they had to fight? Chapter 7. The Mark of the Wolf. The full moon hung heavy in the sky, a luminous pearl casting an ethereal glow over the Blackwood forest. The air was crisp and cold, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. Celine, Alara, and Nix stood at the edge of the hidden grove, a circular clearing surrounded by ancient, towering trees. The silence was profound, broken only by the rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. Celine felt a mixture of fear and anticipation coursing through her veins. She was dressed in a simple white dress, her silver hair braided with ribbons and adorned with sprigs of rosemary and lavender. Alara, standing beside her, was similarly attired, her red hair a vibrant contrast to the pale moonlight. Nyx, however, was transformed. He had shed his human guise, his form shifting, melting, into that of a magnificent wolf. He was larger than any wolf Celine had ever seen, his fur the color of midnight, his eyes still burning with that intense, golden light. He stood at the edge of the clearing, a silent, watchful guardian, his presence both reassuring and terrifying. Celine took a deep breath, trying to calm the frantic flutter of her heart. She held the moonstones in her hand, their smooth surface cool against her skin. She could feel their power, a subtle hum that resonated with the energy of the moon. "Are you ready?" Nyx's voice, though now emanating from the wolf's throat, was still recognizable, still held that low, resonant rumble. Celine nodded, her gaze meeting his golden eyes. "I am." She stepped into the center of the clearing, the moonstones held aloft. Alara began to chant, her voice clear and strong, reciting the words from Moira's book, the ancient invocation to the earth and the moon. The air around them began to shimmer, to vibrate, as the power of the ritual began to build. Celine closed her eyes, focusing on the rhythm of the chant, on the energy of the moonstones, on the connection to the earth beneath her feet. She began to dance, her movements slow and deliberate at first, gradually becoming more fluid, more graceful, as she surrendered to the ancient rhythm. As she danced, she felt a strange sensation, a tingling in her skin, a warmth that spread through her body. She felt herself opening, expanding, becoming a conduit for the power of the moon, for the energy of the earth. She felt the veil thinning, the boundary between worlds blurring. Suddenly, she felt a sharp pain in her shoulder, a burning sensation that made her cry out. She stumbled, her dance faltering, her eyes snapping open. She looked down at her shoulder and saw a mark, a raw, red wound in the shape of a wolf's paw. Nyx, in his wolf form, growled, a deep, guttural sound that echoed through the clearing. He stood between Celine and the edge of the forest, his body tense, his eyes fixed on something in the shadows. "What is it?" Celine asked, her voice trembling. "They are here," Nyx said, his voice a low growl. "The agents of the darkness. They have come to stop the ritual." Celine's heart leaped into her throat. She looked towards the forest, her eyes straining to see through the gloom. She could sense them, a presence, a darkness that pressed against the edge of the clearing, a cold, malevolent energy that made her skin crawl. "What do we do?" Alara asked, her voice filled with fear. "We finished the ritual," Celine said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her heart. "We have to." She closed her eyes again, trying to regain her focus, to reconnect with the energy of the moon, of the earth. But the pain in her shoulder was intense, a constant reminder of the danger that surrounded them. The mark felt alive somehow. Nyx circled her protectively, his growls growing louder, more ferocious. He was ready to defend her, to fight the darkness that threatened to consume them. But Celine knew that this was not a battle that could be won with claws and teeth alone. This was a battle of wills, of magic, of the power of the pact. The ritual had to be completed, no matter the cost. But would this mark hold more answers than questions? And who, or what had inflicted it? Chapter 8. Beneath a sky of broken stars. The shadows at the edge of the grove coalesced, taking on forms that were both terrifying and familiar. They were wolves, but not like Nyx. These wolves were larger, their fur matted and black, their eyes burning with a malevolent red light. They were accompanied by figures shrouded in dark cloaks, their faces hidden in the shadows, their presence radiating a cold, unsettling power. "Nightshades," Nyx growled, his voice filled with a mixture of anger and was it fear? "Corrupted nightshades. They have succumbed to the darkness." Celine's heart pounded against her ribs. She had never seen anything like this before, this manifestation of pure, unadulterated evil. She felt a wave of fear wash over her, threatening to paralyze her. But she fought against it, clinging to the memory of Eleanor's words, to the strength of the pact, to the unwavering presence of Nyx at her side. "We can't let them stop us," Celine said, her voice trembling but firm. She turned to Alara, who was pale and shaking, but still chanting the words of the ritual. "Keep going, Alara. Don't stop." Alara nodded, her eyes fixed on the book in her hands, her voice gaining strength despite her fear. Celine turned back to the encroaching darkness, the moonstones held tightly in her hand. She closed her eyes, focusing on the energy of the moon, on the power of the earth, on the connection to Nyx, to the pact that bound them together. She began to dance again, her movements more frantic now, more desperate, as she fought against the pain in her shoulder, against the fear that threatened to consume her. She felt the veil thinning, the boundary between worlds blurring, the power of the ritual reaching its peak. The corrupted nightshades lunged, their red eyes burning with hatred, their claws extended, ready to tear. Nyx met them head-on, his own claws and teeth bared, his growls echoing through the clearing. He fought with a ferocity that was both terrifying and awe-inspiring, a whirlwind of fur and fangs, protecting Celine from the onslaught. But there were too many of them. They swarmed him, overwhelming him, their combined power pushing him back. Celine could see the strain in his movements, the weariness in his eyes. He was strong, but he couldn't fight them all alone. She had to do something. She had to help him. She remembered Eleanor's words about the moonstones, about their ability to open a doorway to the other side. It was a dangerous path, but she had no choice. She had to take the risk. She raised the moonstones above her head, focusing all her will, all her energy, on opening the veil, on drawing upon the power of the other side. She felt a surge of energy, a tingling that spread through her body, a connection to something ancient, something powerful, something terrifying. The sky above the clearing seemed to crack, to shatter, revealing a glimpse of another world, a realm of swirling shadows and distorted landscapes. The air grew cold, a biting wind that whipped through the trees, carrying with it the scent of decay and something else. Something indescribable, something that made Celine's skin crawl. The corrupted nightshades recoiled, their red eyes widening in fear. They whimpered, their movements becoming hesitant, their aggression fading. The cloaked figures, too, seemed to shrink back, their shadows flickering, their power waning. Celine had opened the doorway. But what had she unleashed? From the swirling shadows of the other side, a figure emerged. It was tall and imposing, its form indistinct, its features shrouded in darkness. But its eyes burned with a cold, blue light, a light that seemed to pierce Celine's soul. It was the entity, the darkness, the thing the pact was meant to contain. Celine felt a wave of terror wash over her, so intense that it threatened to break her. She wanted to scream, to run, to hide. But she couldn't. She had to stand her ground. She had to face it. She had summoned it, and now she was trapped. What power could she possibly wield against this ancient, unknowable entity? Chapter 9. The Taste of Iron and Regret. The entity stood at the edge of the fractured reality, its blue eyes fixed on Celine, radiating an ancient, all-consuming cold. It did not speak, did not move, yet its presence was a crushing weight, a suffocating pressure that stole the air from Celine's lungs. She felt her knees weaken, her body tremble, the moonstones slipping from her grasp. Nyx, battered and bleeding, but still fighting, let out a defiant roar, placing himself between Celine and the entity. The corrupted nightshades, momentarily stunned by the entity's arrival, renewed their attack, their red eyes burning with a desperate, fanatical zeal. "Celine, close the veil," Nyx roared, his voice hoarse with exertion. "You must close it now." But Celine was frozen, paralyzed by fear and a strange, unsettling fascination. She had never felt anything like this before, this sense of absolute, overwhelming power. It was terrifying, yet strangely alluring. The entity took a step forward, and the ground beneath its feet cracked, the air shimmering with distorted energy. It raised a hand, its long, skeletal fingers reaching toward Celine.
No!
Alara screamed, dropping the book and rushing toward Celine, trying to pull her away. But it was too late. The entity's touch was like ice, a burning cold that seared Celine's skin, that penetrated deep into her soul. She felt a jolt of energy, a shock that threw her backwards, sending her crashing to the ground. She lay there, stunned, her body numb, her mind reeling. She could taste iron in her mouth, and realized it was her own blood. She had bitten her tongue during the fall. She looked up at the sky, at the fractured veil, at the entity that now stood over her, its blue eyes burning with a cold, triumphant light. Regret washed through her, bitter and sharp. She had failed. She had opened the doorway, and now the darkness was free. Nyx lunged at the entity, his claws raking across its shadowy form, but his attack seemed to have little effect. The entity simply swatted him aside, sending him flying through the air, his body colliding with a tree with a sickening thud. Alara knelt beside Celine, her hands hovering over her, her face pale with terror. "Celine, are you all right?" Celine tried to speak, but her voice was caught in her throat. She could only manage a weak nod. The entity turned its attention to Alara, its blue eyes narrowing. It raised its hand again, and Alara screamed, shielding her face. But the attack never came. Instead, a figure appeared, seemingly out of nowhere, intercepting the entity's blow. It was Nyx, back in his human form, his face contorted with rage, his golden eyes burning with a fierce, protective light. He held a sword in his hand, a blade of shimmering silver, etched with ancient runes. It was a weapon Celine had never seen before, a weapon that seemed to radiate its own power. "You will not touch them," Nyx growled, his voice filled with a deadly calm. He attacked the entity with a speed and ferocity that Celine had never witnessed before. The silver blade flashed in the moonlight, striking the entity's shadowy form, drawing sparks of blue energy. The entity recoiled, its form flickering, its blue eyes widening in surprise. Was it possible to surprise such an ancient, powerful being? Nyx pressed his attack, his movements fluid and graceful, a deadly dance of sword and shadow. He seemed to be drawing upon some hidden reserve of power, his strength renewed, his determination unwavering. He was no longer the creature of the pact, he was pure warrior. Celine watched in awe and terror, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never seen this side of Nyx, this raw, untamed power, this fierce protectiveness. It was both terrifying and strangely exhilarating. But even as she watched, she knew that this battle was far from over. The entity was wounded, but not defeated. And the corrupted nightshades were still a threat, their red eyes burning with hatred, their claws extended, ready to strike. What could Nyx possibly do alone, against such overwhelming odds? And where had that sword come from? Chapter 10. A symphony of whispers and lies. The battle raged in the clearing, a chaotic symphony of snarls, growls, and the clang of silver against shadow. Nyx fought with a desperate courage, the silver sword a blur of motion, deflecting blows, parrying attacks, his movements a deadly ballet. He seemed to be everywhere at once, protecting Celine and Alara from the corrupted nightshades, holding the entity at bay. Celine, still weak and disoriented, could only watch, her heart aching with a mixture of fear, admiration, and guilt. She had caused this. She had opened the doorway, unleashed the darkness. And now, Nyx was risking his life to protect her. "We have to help him," Alara said, her voice trembling. She had retrieved Moira's book, her fingers frantically flipping through the pages, searching for something, anything, that could give them an advantage. Celine nodded, trying to gather her strength, to push past the pain and the fear. She reached for the moonstones, which had fallen near her, their smooth surface now cold and lifeless. They seemed to have lost their power, their connection to the moon severed by the entity's presence. I don't know what to do, Celine whispered, her voice filled with despair. Elara stopped flipping through the pages, her eyes widening in realization. The mark, she exclaimed. The wolf's paw mark on your shoulder. It's a connection, a link to Nyx's power. Maybe you can use it to help him. Celine looked down at her shoulder, at the raw, red wound. It still burned, still felt strangely alive. She hesitated, fear gnawing at her. What if she made things worse? What if she couldn't control the power? But she had no choice. She had to try. She closed her eyes, focusing on the mark, on the pain, on the connection to Nyx. She reached out with her mind, searching for him, for his essence, for the power that flowed through him. She found him. She felt his strength, his determination, his fierce protectiveness. She also felt his pain, his exhaustion, his growing desperation. She sent a surge of her own energy towards him, a wave of will, of support, of love. Nyx stumbled, his movements faltering for a moment. He looked at Celine, his golden eyes widening in surprise. He seemed to feel her presence, her energy, flowing into him. He straightened, his body renewed, his strength returning. He roared, a sound that shook the very ground, a sound that echoed with newfound power. He attacked the entity with renewed vigor, the silver sword flashing in the moonlight, striking with even greater force. The entity recoiled, its form flickering, its blue eyes burning with a mixture of anger and fear. The corrupted nightshades, too, seemed to falter, their movements becoming hesitant, their aggression waning. They were losing their connection to the darkness, their power diminishing. But the entity was not defeated. It gathered its strength, its shadowy form expanding, its blue eyes burning with an intense, malevolent light. It unleashed a wave of energy, a blast of cold that swept through the clearing, knocking Nyx off his feet, sending the corrupted nightshades scattering. Celine cried out, her heart filled with terror. She watched as the entity loomed over Nyx, its hand raised, ready to deliver the final blow. Lies she had told herself about her own power and Nyx's true nature came rushing to the fore. It felt as if all the deceit of her ancestry was laid bare. But then, something unexpected happened. A voice, clear and strong, echoed through the clearing. Enough. The entity froze, its hand still raised, its blue eyes turning towards the source of the voice. Standing at the edge of the clearing, bathed in the pale moonlight, was an old woman. She was tall and slender, her silver hair braided down her back, her eyes were the same golden color as Nyx's. It was Eleanor, Celine's grandmother. But that was impossible. Eleanor was dead. The impossible had become reality. But how? And whose side was she truly on? Chapter 11. The Garden of Lost Souls. A stunned silence fell over the clearing. The corrupted nightshades cowered, their red eyes flickering nervously. The entity remained frozen, its blue eyes fixed on Eleanor, its shadowy form trembling slightly. Nyx, slowly getting to his feet, stared at the woman with a mixture of disbelief and something else. Something Celine couldn't quite decipher. Grandmother? Celine whispered, her voice barely audible. She couldn't believe her eyes. This was impossible. A dream. A hallucination. Yet, there she stood, as real and solid as anything in the clearing. Eleanor didn't look at Celine. Her golden eyes remained fixed on the entity, her expression stern and unwavering. I said, enough, she repeated, her voice firm, laced with an authority that commanded attention. You will not harm them. The entity slowly lowered its hand, its blue eyes dimming slightly. Eleanor, it said, its voice a low, guttural rumble that seemed to vibrate the very air. You should not be here. This is not your realm. This is my forest, Eleanor retorted, her voice sharp. And these are my descendants. You will leave them alone. The entity hesitated, its shadowy form flickering. It seemed to be weighing its options, calculating its chances. You cannot defy me, Eleanor, it said. You are bound by the old laws. The old laws are broken, Eleanor replied. The pact is failing. You have overstepped your bounds. She took a step forward, and the entity recoiled, a flicker of fear in its blue eyes. I offer you a choice, Eleanor said. Return to your realm, and wait for the pact to be renewed. Or face the consequences. The entity remained silent for a moment, its shadowy form swirling, its blue eyes burning with a cold, calculating light. Then, slowly, it began to fade, to dissipate, its form becoming less distinct, less solid. This is not over, Eleanor, it said, its voice fading to a whisper. The darkness will return, and you will not be able to stop it. Then it was gone. The fractured veil above the clearing sealed itself, the stars returning to their rightful places in the night sky. The corrupted nightshades, their power broken, whimpered and fled into the forest, their red eyes dimming, their forms shrinking back to their natural size. Silence descended once more, broken only by the ragged breathing of Nyx, who was still leaning heavily on the silver sword, his body covered in wounds. Celine rushed to his side, her heart filled with concern. Nyx, are you all right? He nodded slowly, his golden eyes meeting hers. I am alive, he said, his voice hoarse. Thanks to her. He looked at Eleanor, who was now approaching them, her movements graceful and serene, her expression unreadable. Celine turned to her grandmother, her mind reeling with questions. Grandmother, how is this possible? Eleanor smiled faintly, a sad, wistful smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. It's a long story, Celine, she said. A story that spans centuries. She reached out a hand and gently touched Celine's cheek. Her touch was warm, comforting, a stark contrast to the icy touch of the entity. I am not truly alive, my dear, she said. Not in the way you understand it. I am a guardian, a protector, bound to this forest, to the Ashworth line, by the original pact. Celine's mind struggled to grasp the concept. But you died. I saw my physical body died, Eleanor corrected. But my spirit remained, bound to this place, to the duty of protecting the veil. She turned her attention to Nyx, her golden eyes meeting his. There was a silent exchange between them, a look that spoke of a shared history, of a deep, unspoken connection. Celine felt a pang of jealousy. It was an irrational feeling, she knew, but she couldn't help it. You have done well, Nyx, Eleanor said, her voice softening. You have protected them. Nyx nodded, his expression still guarded. It was my duty, he said. Eleanor turned back to Celine and Alara, who was standing silently beside them, her eyes wide with awe and confusion. You both have shown great courage, Eleanor said. You have faced the darkness, and you have survived. But the journey is far from over. The pact must still be renewed. She gestured towards a path that led deeper into the forest, a path that Celine had never noticed before. Come, she said. There is a place we must go. A place where the veil is thin, where the power of the earth is strong. A place called the Garden of Lost Souls. What new revelations awaited in this hidden garden, and how long had Eleanor really been watching? Chapter 12. Threads of Silver. Threads of Fate. The path to the Garden of Lost Souls wound through the deepest part of the Blackwood Forest, a place where the trees grew so tall and thick that the moonlight barely penetrated, casting the woods in perpetual twilight. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else, a sweet, floral fragrance that was both intoxicating and unsettling. Celine walked beside Nyx, who had shifted back to his human form, his wounds slowly healing, thanks to his supernatural resilience. Alara followed close behind, her eyes darting nervously from side to side, her hand clutching Moira's book. Eleanor led the way, her movements silent and graceful, her silver hair gleaming in the dim light. What is this place, grandmother? Celine asked, her voice a hushed whisper. What is the Garden of Lost Souls? Eleanor didn't answer immediately. She continued walking, her gaze fixed on the path ahead. It is a place of power, she said finally. A place where the veil between worlds is at its thinnest. A place where the spirits of those who have died in Blackwood Hollow linger. Celine's heart skipped a beat. Spirits? She had always been sensitive to the presence of spirits, able to sense their emotions, their memories, their lingering attachments to the world of the living. But she had never encountered a place like this, a place where they gathered in such numbers. "Why are we going there?" Alara asked, her voice trembling slightly. "The garden holds the key to renewing the pact," Eleanor replied. "It is a place where we can draw upon the collective energy of the past, of those who came before us, to strengthen the veil." As they walked deeper into the forest, the sweet, floral fragrance grew stronger, almost overwhelming. Celine began to see them then, flickering shapes in the shadows, translucent forms that shimmered in the dim light. They were spirits, the souls of the departed, their faces pale and mournful, their eyes filled with a longing for a world they could no longer touch. Some of them reached out to Celine, their touch like a whisper of cold air, their voices murmuring in her mind, fragments of memories, of emotions, of regrets. She felt a wave of sadness wash over her, a deep, profound sorrow for these lost souls, trapped between worlds. Nyx seemed unaffected by the spirits. He walked with his head held high, his golden eyes focused, his expression grim. He was used to this, Celine realized. He had walked among spirits for centuries. They reached the garden, a circular clearing surrounded by ancient, gnarled trees. In the center of the clearing was a pool of water, its surface still and dark, reflecting the faint moonlight like a mirror. The air here was thick with energy, a palpable hum that vibrated through Celine's bones. "This is it," Eleanor said, her voice hushed with reverence. "The heart of the garden." She gestured towards the pool. "The water holds the memories of the past," she said. "It is a conduit to the other side. We must use it to perform the final ritual, to weave the threads of silver, the threads of fate, that will renew the pact." She turned to Celine and Alara. "You both have a role to play," she said. "Celine, you will draw upon the energy of the moon, the power of your lineage, to strengthen the veil. Alara, you will use your knowledge of herbs, of the earth's magic, to bind the energy, to weave it into the fabric of the pact." She looked at Nyx. "And you, Nyx, will be the anchor. You will hold the space, protect them from any interference, from any lingering darkness that might try to disrupt the ritual." Nyx nodded, his expression solemn. "I understand," he said. Celine felt a surge of fear, but also a sense of determination. This was it, the final step, the moment of truth. She had to be strong. She had to succeed. She stepped towards the pool, her heart pounding in her chest. The water was cold, dark, and inviting. She could feel the pull of the other side, the whisper of the spirits, the weight of the past. The air was growing thick, making it difficult to breathe. What, exactly, would this final ritual entail, and what price would have to be paid to mend the threads of this ancient, devouring pact? Chapter 13. The Price of a Promise. Eleanor instructed Celine and Alara to stand on opposite sides of the pool, their hands outstretched, palms facing the water. Nyx stood behind them, his silver sword drawn, his golden eyes scanning the surrounding forest, a watchful guardian. "Close your eyes," Eleanor said, her voice soft but firm. "Focus on your intentions. Focus on the pact, on the need to strengthen the veil, to protect Blackwood Hollow from the darkness." Celine closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, trying to calm the frantic flutter of her heart. She focused on the image of the forest, on the people she loved, on the need to keep them safe. She felt a connection to Alara, to Nyx, to Eleanor, a bond forged in shared purpose, in shared danger. "Now," Eleanor said, "recite the words. Let the energy flow through you. Let the power of the past, of the earth, of the moon, guide your hands." Celine and Alara began to chant, their voices blending together in a harmonious melody, the ancient words of the ritual echoing through the clearing. The air around them began to shimmer, to vibrate, as the power of the ritual began to build. Celine felt a tingling sensation in her hands, a warmth that spread through her body. She felt the energy of the moon flowing into her, the power of her ancestors, the strength of the Ashworth line. She felt the veil thinning, the boundary between worlds blurring. She opened her eyes and gasped. The surface of the pool was no longer still and dark. It was swirling, glowing with a silvery light, reflecting not the moon above, but a vision of another world, a realm of swirling shadows and ethereal landscapes. She could see the spirits of the departed, their faces pale and mournful, their eyes filled with a longing for a world they could no longer touch. But she also saw something else. Something darker, something more menacing. A flicker of blue light, a hint of a shadowy form, a presence that made her skin crawl. The entity. It was still there, lurking at the edges of the veil, waiting for an opportunity to break through. "Keep going," Eleanor urged, her voice strained. "Don't lose focus. Weave the threads. Strengthen the pact." Celine tried to focus, to ignore the entity's presence, to concentrate on the ritual. But it was difficult. The fear was overwhelming, the darkness seductive. She felt herself slipping, losing control, the power of the ritual threatening to consume her. Suddenly, she felt a hand on her shoulder, a warm, steadying presence. It was Nick's. He had moved closer, his body shielding hers, his golden eyes filled with concern. "Celine," he said, his voice a low murmur, "you are strong. Stronger than you know. Don't give in to the fear. Focus on me. Focus on the pact." His words, his touch, gave her strength. She drew upon his energy, his unwavering resolve, his fierce protectiveness. She regained her focus, her control, the power of the ritual flowing through her once more. She and Ilara continued to chant, their voices growing stronger, more confident. The silvery light emanating from the pool intensified, the swirling shadows receding, the entity's presence fading. But then, Eleanor cried out, a sharp, pained sound that made Celine's heart leap into her throat. Celine looked at her grandmother and saw that she was weakening, her form flickering, her silver hair losing its luster. The effort of maintaining the ritual, of holding the space, was taking its toll. "Grandmother," Celine cried. "What's happening?" "The pact demands a price," Eleanor gasped, her voice weak. "A sacrifice. To renew it, to strengthen the veil, something must be given in return." Celine's blood ran cold. "A sacrifice? What kind of sacrifice?" Eleanor looked at her, her golden eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and acceptance. "My time is over," she said. "I have fulfilled my purpose. I am ready to return to the source."
"No,"
Celine screamed. "There has to be another way." But there wasn't. Eleanor was fading, her form becoming translucent, her spirit preparing to depart. She smiled faintly, a sad, wistful smile. "Do not grieve for me, my dear," she said. "I will always be with you. In the wind, in the trees, in the moonlight, in your heart." Then, with a final sigh, she was gone. Her spirit dissipated, merging with the silvery light of the pool, becoming one with the energy of the pact. Celine felt a wave of grief wash over her, so intense that it threatened to break her. But she knew she couldn't give in to despair. She had to finish the ritual. She had to honor Eleanor's sacrifice. The price of a promise made long ago. What would the renewed pact truly mean for Celine and Nyx, now bound by this sacrifice? The air itself seemed to crackle with the unanswered question. Chapter 14. Where Shadows Hold Their Breath. The silvery light emanating from the pool intensified, blindingly bright, then slowly faded, the swirling shadows receding, the surface of the water returning to its still, dark state. The air, which had been thick with energy, now felt calm, peaceful, the silence profound. Celine stood there, numb with grief, tears streaming down her face. Ilara, too, was crying, her body shaking with sobs. Nyx stood beside Celine, his hand resting on her shoulder, his presence a silent, comforting support. He didn't speak, didn't offer any words of consolation. He simply stood there, his golden eyes filled with a deep, unspoken sorrow. The pact was renewed. The veil was strengthened. Blackwood Hollow was safe for now. But the price had been steep. Eleanor was gone. Celine felt a profound sense of loss, a gaping hole in her heart. She had only just rediscovered her grandmother, only just begun to understand her, to appreciate her strength, her wisdom, her sacrifice. And now she was gone. She's gone, Celine whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Nick squeezed her shoulder gently. She's at peace, he said, his voice low and somber. She has returned to the source, to the energy from which we all came. His words offered little comfort. Celine couldn't shake the feeling that she had failed Eleanor, that she hadn't been strong enough to save her. It's my fault, she said, her voice trembling. I opened the doorway. I unleashed the darkness. If it hadn't been for me, Nix turned her to face him, his golden eyes searching hers. Do not blame yourself, Celine, he said, his voice firm. You did what you had to do. You faced the darkness and you survived. You are stronger than you think. He gently wiped away her tears with his thumb, his touch surprisingly gentle. Eleanor knew the risks, he continued. She made her choice. She sacrificed herself willingly to protect the forest, to protect you. His words, his touch, his unwavering support began to penetrate the numbness that had enveloped her. She looked at him, at his intense gaze, at the hint of vulnerability that flickered beneath his stoic facade. She saw not just a creature of shadow and moonlight, but a man, a being capable of deep emotion, of profound loss. Thank you, Nix, she whispered, her voice still trembling. For everything. He nodded slowly, his golden eyes holding hers. We are bound, Celine, he said. By blood, by magic, by fate. I will always protect you. He released her, stepping back, his gaze shifting to the surrounding forest. We should leave this place, he said. It is time to return. They walked back through the forest, the path now illuminated by the first rays of dawn, the sky above a pale, pearly gray. The spirits were gone, the garden silent and still, the air filled with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, the sweet, floral fragrance now faded. As they walked, Celine felt a growing sense of unease. The pact was renewed, but something felt unfinished. There were still questions unanswered, secrets unresolved. Nix, she said, her voice hesitant, there's something I don't understand. Eleanor, she said, the pact demanded a sacrifice. But why her? Why now? Nix hesitated, his expression guarded. The pact is a complex thing, Celine, he said. It is not always easy to understand its workings. It draws upon the energy of the living, of the earth, of the moon. Sometimes a sacrifice is required to balance the scales, to restore the equilibrium. His explanation was vague, unsatisfying. Celine sensed that he was holding something back, that he wasn't telling her the whole truth. But there must be more to it than that, she persisted. There has to be a reason why it was Eleanor, why it happened now. Nick stopped walking, his golden eyes meeting hers. He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, he sighed, a deep, weary sound. There are things, Celine, he said, his voice low and somber, that are best left unknown. Secrets that are better left buried. He started walking again, his pace quickening, his silence a heavy weight between them. Celine followed, her mind racing, her heart filled with a growing sense of dread. What secrets was Nick's hiding? And why was he so reluctant to share them with her? The shadows of Blackwood Hollow seemed to deepen around them, whispering secrets she wasn't sure she wanted to hear. What truly remained hidden, and would it stay that way? Chapter 15. The Language of Scars. Back at the cottage, the atmosphere was heavy with unspoken grief and lingering questions. Alara, exhausted and emotionally drained, had fallen asleep on the sofa, curled up under a blanket. Celine sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window at the gray dawn, her mind replaying the events of the night, searching for answers, for some sense of closure. Nix was in the living room, tending to his wounds. He had refused Celine's offer of help, preferring to treat himself, his movements efficient and practiced. He moved with a quiet grace, a predator nursing its injuries, preparing for the next battle. Celine watched him through the doorway, her gaze drawn to the scars that crisscrossed his body, pale lines against his tanned skin. They were old scars, battle scars, reminders of a long and violent past. She wondered about their stories, about the battles he had fought, the enemies he had faced, the losses he had endured. She had seen a glimpse of that past last night, in the hidden grove, when he had wielded the silver sword, when he had fought the entity with such fierce protectiveness. She had seen a side of him that was both terrifying and compelling. She realized, with a jolt, that she knew very little about him. She knew he was a nightshade, a shapeshifter, a guardian bound to her by the pact. But she didn't know him, the man beneath the creature, the soul beneath the shadows. She got up and walked into the living room, her footsteps silent on the wooden floor. Nix looked up, his golden eyes meeting hers. He was shirtless, his torso a tapestry of scars, a testament to his long and turbulent existence. Can I help you with that?" Celine asked, her voice hesitant, gesturing towards a particularly nasty-looking gash on his shoulder, one that was still bleeding slightly. He hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Very well," he said. She fetched a bowl of warm water, some clean cloths, and the herbal salve that Alara had prepared. She sat beside him on the sofa, her hands trembling slightly as she began to clean the wound. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the sound of their breathing, by the gentle lapping of the water against his skin. Celine focused on the task at hand, trying to ignore the proximity of his body, the warmth of his skin, the faint scent of pine and rain that clung to him. "These scars," she said, her voice barely a whisper. They tell a story, don't they?" Nix didn't answer immediately. He looked down at his body, at the intricate network of scars, his expression unreadable. "They are reminders," he said finally, his voice low and somber. "Reminders of battles fought, of mistakes made, of lives lost." "Tell me about them," Celine said, her voice gaining strength. "Tell me about your past." He looked at her, his golden eyes searching hers. He seemed to be weighing her request, considering whether to trust her, whether to reveal the secrets he had guarded for so long. "It is a long story, Celine," he said. "A story filled with darkness, with violence, with loss." "I want to know," she persisted. "I need to know. I need to understand you." He sighed, a deep, weary sound. "Very well," he said. "But be warned, Celine. The truth is not always pretty. It can be unsettling." He began to speak, his voice a low murmur, telling her of his long life, of his origins as a nightshade, of the centuries he had spent protecting Blackwood Hollow, of the battles he had fought, of the loved ones he had lost. He spoke of the original pact, of the sacrifices that had been made, of the burden he had carried for so long. He was opening a door, and Celine was no longer certain she was ready to walk through it. The scars were more than marks on flesh, they etched a landscape of a tormented soul. How much of that soul could she bear to see? Chapter 16. A river of tears and moonlight. Nix's story unfolded like a dark, ancient tapestry, woven with threads of violence, loss, and a profound, enduring loneliness. He spoke of his birth, centuries ago, into the Nightshade clan, a powerful family of shapeshifters who had lived in Blackwood Hollow since time immemorial. He described his training, the rigorous discipline, the honing of his skills as a warrior, as a protector. He spoke of the early days of the pact, of the alliance forged between the Nightshades and the Ashworths, a desperate attempt to contain the ancient entity that threatened to consume the land. He described the battles fought, the sacrifices made, the lives lost. He spoke of Eleanor's ancestor, Lyra, the first Ashworth to bind herself to a nightshade, a woman of extraordinary power and courage. He spoke of their love, a forbidden love that had defied the conventions of their time, a love that had ultimately ended in tragedy. "Lyra was everything to me," Nix said, his voice thick with emotion, his golden eyes clouded with a pain that seemed to span centuries. "She was my soulmate, my anchor, my reason for being." He described how Lyra had sacrificed herself to strengthen the pact, to contain the entity, to protect Blackwood Hollow. He spoke of his grief, his rage, his despair, his vow to honor her memory, to continue the fight, to uphold the pact. "I have lived with her loss for centuries," he said, his voice a low, mournful whisper. I have carried her memory, her spirit, within me, always. Celine listened, her heart aching for him, for the pain he had endured, for the burden he had carried for so long. She understood now his stoicism, his guarded nature, his reluctance to reveal his past. He was a creature of shadows, of secrets, but beneath it all, he was a being capable of profound love, of profound loss. As he spoke, Celine continued to tend to his wounds, her touch gentle, her presence a silent offering of comfort. She felt a connection to him that transcended the pact, that transcended their differences, a bond forged in shared sorrow, in shared understanding. The scar on your shoulder, Nick said, his voice drawing her attention back to the present. The mark of the wolf. It is a symbol of our bond, Celine. A connection that goes deeper than the pact. Celine looked down at her shoulder, at the raw, red wound, which was now beginning to heal, the skin knitting itself back together. It still ached, but the pain was less intense, more bearable. What does it mean? She asked. Nix hesitated, his expression guarded. It means we are linked, he said. Not just by magic, but by something more. Something that even I do not fully understand. His words sent a shiver down her spine. What was this something more? What was the true nature of their connection? He finished his story, his voice fading to a whisper, his golden eyes filled with a deep, unsettling sadness. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken emotions, with unresolved questions. Celine looked at him, at his scarred face, at his weary eyes, at the hint of vulnerability that flickered beneath his stoic facade. She felt a surge of love. It was a dangerous emotion, she knew, a feeling that could lead to heartbreak, to betrayal. But she couldn't deny it. She loved him. She reached out and gently touched his cheek, her fingers tracing the lines of his face, the contours of his scars. He leaned into her touch, his eyes closing, a sigh escaping his lips. The moonlight streamed through the window, bathing them in its pale, ethereal glow. Tears welled up in Celine's eyes, tears of grief, of loss, of hope. Tears for Eleanor, for Lyra, for Nix, for herself. A river of tears, flowing under the watchful gaze of the moon. But what did this connection mean? It was more than the pact dictated, and the depth of his feelings were still concealed. Would their bond be a blessing or another curse? Chapter 17. The Unveiling of Ancient Truths. The following days were a blur of quiet reflection and unsettling discoveries. Alara, still reeling from the loss of Moira and the revelation of her own heritage, decided to stay with Celine, finding solace in their shared grief and the shared responsibility of the pact. They spent hours poring over Moira's book, deciphering its cryptic passages, trying to piece together the missing pieces of the puzzle. Nix, meanwhile, was distant, withdrawn, spending most of his time in the forest, his presence a shadow that flitted at the edges of Celine's awareness. She sensed his turmoil, his struggle to reconcile his past with the present, his feelings for her with the burden of the pact. One afternoon, while exploring the attic again, Celine stumbled upon a hidden compartment in Eleanor's old wooden chest. Inside, she found a small, leather-bound diary, its pages filled with Eleanor's elegant script. It was a personal journal, a record of her thoughts, her feelings, her fears, her secrets. Celine hesitated, feeling a sense of unease, of intruding upon her grandmother's private world. But she knew she had to read it. She needed to understand Eleanor, to understand the pact, to understand Nix. She sat down at the kitchen table, Alara beside her, and began to read. The diary entries spanned decades, chronicling Eleanor's life from her youth to her final days. They revealed a woman of extraordinary strength, of unwavering dedication, of profound love for her family, for Blackwood Hollow, for Nix. As Celine read, she began to uncover a truth that was both shocking and heartbreaking. Eleanor had not simply been a guardian, a protector of the pact. She had been Nix's lover. The diary entries spoke of their secret meetings, their stolen moments, their passionate, forbidden love. They spoke of Eleanor's struggle to reconcile her feelings for Nyx with her duty to the pact, with the knowledge that their love could never be fully realized, that they were bound by fate to different paths. "He is my soulmate," Eleanor wrote in one entry, her words filled with a mixture of longing and despair. "But he is not mine to keep. He is bound to the pact, to the forest, to the ancient ways. I can only love him from afar, in the shadows, in the silence." Celine's heart ached for her grandmother, for the pain she had endured, for the sacrifices she had made. She understood now Eleanor's final words, her acceptance of her fate, her willingness to sacrifice herself to renew the pact. She had done it not only to protect Blackwood Hollow, but to protect Nyx, the man she loved. But the diary also revealed another, even more startling truth. A truth that sent a chill down Celine's spine, that made her question everything she thought she knew. In her final entry, written just days before her death, Eleanor revealed the true nature of the pact, the true price of its renewal. "The pact is not what we believe it to be," she wrote. "It is not simply a barrier against the darkness. It is a prison. A prison for the entity, yes, but also a prison for the nightshade, who is bound to it. The pact demands not just a sacrifice of life, but a sacrifice of soul. The nightshade who renews the pact must give up a part of themselves, a piece of their essence, to keep the entity contained. With each renewal, the nightshade becomes less. Less human, less feeling, less alive." Celine gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. This was the secret Nyx had been hiding. This was the truth he had been so reluctant to reveal. The pact was slowly killing him, draining him of his essence, turning him into a shadow of his former self. And she, by calling his name, by sealing the pact, had condemned him to this fate. The truth hit her like a physical blow, a crushing weight that stole the air from her lungs. She had to know. She had to understand. And she knew, then, that there was only one way to find the truth, to see through the eyes of the entity itself. Chapter 18. The Heart's Reckoning. The realization of the pact's true nature, and Nyx's slow, agonizing sacrifice, left Celine reeling. She felt a mixture of horror, guilt, and a fierce, desperate determination to find a way to break the cycle, to save him, even if it meant facing the entity again. She knew the risk was immense. The moonstones, the conduit to the other side, had been weakened by the previous encounter. To use them again, to willingly open a doorway to the entity's realm, was to invite unimaginable danger. But she couldn't stand by and watch Nyx slowly fade away, his essence consumed by the pact. She confided in Alara, sharing the devastating truth revealed in Eleanor's diary. Alara, initially shocked and horrified, quickly rallied, her own sense of responsibility, of loyalty to Nyx and to Celine, overcoming her fear. "We have to do something," Alara said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. "We have to find a way to break the pact, to free him." They spent the next few days researching, poring over Moira's book and Eleanor's diary, searching for any clue, any hint of a way to break the cycle of sacrifice, to sever the connection between Nyx and the entity without unleashing the darkness upon Blackwood Hollow. They discovered fragments of ancient lore, whispers of forgotten rituals, hints of a power that lay dormant within the Ashworth line, a power that could potentially rewrite the terms of the pact. But the information was incomplete, fragmented, the rituals dangerous and unpredictable. Celine knew that the only way to truly understand the pact, to find a way to break it, was to confront the entity directly, to see through its eyes, to understand its origins, its motivations, its weaknesses. She decided to use the moonstones again, to open a doorway to the other side, not to fight the entity, but to communicate with it. It was a reckless plan, a desperate gamble, but she saw no other option. She waited for the next new moon, a time when the veil between worlds was said to be at its thinnest, when the connection to the other side was strongest. She prepared herself meticulously, gathering the necessary herbs, drawing protective symbols on the floor of the clearing behind her cottage, reciting the ancient incantations from Moira's book. Nyx, sensing her intentions, tried to dissuade her, his golden eyes filled with concern, with fear. "This is too dangerous, Celine," he said, his voice low and urgent. "You cannot risk yourself like this. The entity is too powerful. It will consume you." "I have to try, Nyx," she said, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. "I have to do this for you, for us, for Blackwood Hollow." She looked at him, at his scarred face, at his weary eyes, at the hint of vulnerability that flickered beneath his stoic facade. She saw the toll the pact had taken on him, the slow erosion of his spirit, his essence. "I love you, Nyx," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "And I won't let the pact destroy you. I won't let it take you from me." He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the lines of her face. "And I love you, Celine," he said, his voice a low, mournful whisper. "But please be careful." Under the new moon, surrounded by the protective circle, Celine sat in the center, moonstones in hand. Her heart pounded in her chest like a trapped bird. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and called upon the power that was her birthright. She had to understand, and she knew that understanding began with feeling. But would feeling the entity's power shatter her, or make her strong? Chapter 19. A Crown of Thorns and Starlight. The world dissolved around Celine as she invoked the moonstones, the familiar scent of pine and damp earth replaced by a chilling void, a sensation of falling through an endless abyss. The protective circle she had drawn seemed to shimmer and fade, its power insufficient to shield her from the raw, untamed energy of the other side. She opened her eyes and gasped. She wasn't in the clearing anymore. She was elsewhere. A landscape of swirling shadows and distorted realities, a realm where the laws of physics seemed to have no meaning. The air was cold, heavy, filled with a sense of ancient, overwhelming power. She saw the entity not as a shadowy figure, but as a being of immense, terrifying beauty. It was tall and slender, its form shimmering, iridescent, its features both human and alien. Its eyes were no longer a cold, blue light, but a swirling vortex of colors, a kaleidoscope of emotions, of memories, of experiences that span millennia. It did not speak, but Celine felt its presence, its thoughts, its feelings, flooding her mind, overwhelming her senses. She saw its origins, its creation, its purpose. It was not inherently evil, not a force of darkness, but a being of immense power, a guardian of a different realm, a realm that had once been connected to Blackwood Hollow. She saw the original pact, not as a prison, but as a bridge, a connection between two worlds, a way for the two realms to share their energy, their knowledge, their wisdom. But the bridge had been broken, corrupted, twisted into a prison, a source of pain and suffering. She saw the nightshades, not as willing allies, but as victims, forced to sacrifice themselves to maintain the corrupted pact, to keep the entity contained. She saw Lyra, Eleanor's ancestor, not as a hero, but as a pawn, manipulated by forces she did not understand, her love for Nyx used against her, against him. She saw Nyx, his long life, his centuries of suffering, his slow, agonizing decline. She felt his pain, his loneliness, his despair, his unwavering determination to protect Blackwood Hollow, to protect her, even at the cost of his own soul. The entity showed her the truth, the raw, unfiltered truth of the pact, of its origins, of its corruption, of its devastating consequences. It showed her the way to break the cycle, to sever the connection without unleashing the darkness, to restore the balance, to heal the bridge between worlds. But it also showed her the price. The price was not a sacrifice of life, but a sacrifice of memory. To break the pact, to sever the connection, Celine had to give up all memory of Nyx, of their love, of their shared past. She had to forget him completely, to erase him from her mind, from her heart, from her soul. The entity presented it as a choice between saving Nyx and saving her memories of him, a choice between his freedom and her own happiness. A cruel, agonizing choice. Celine wept, tears streaming down her face, her body shaking with sobs. She couldn't do it. She couldn't forget him. She couldn't erase him from her life. He was her soulmate, her anchor, her reason for being. But she also knew that she couldn't let him continue to suffer, to slowly fade away, his essence consumed by the pact. She had to save him, even if it meant losing him forever. She looked at the entity, her vision blurred by tears, her heart breaking. I accept, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. I will pay the price. The entity seemed to smile, a sad, wistful smile that flickered across its shimmering features. So be it, it said, its voice a chorus of whispers, of echoes, of ancient, forgotten tongues. Celine felt a sharp pain in her head, a searing sensation that made her cry out. She felt her memories fading, her emotions dissolving, her connection to Nick's unraveling. She saw his face, his golden eyes, his scarred features, fading, blurring, disappearing from her mind, from her heart, from her soul. It was a crown of thorns, adorned with fading starlight. Then, darkness. Chapter 20. The final embrace of destiny. Celine awoke in the clearing, the moonstones lying beside her, their surface dull and lifeless. The protective circle was intact, the air calm and peaceful, the scent of pine and damp earth filling her senses. She felt empty, a hollow ache in her chest, a sense of profound loss, of something missing, something she couldn't quite grasp. Alara was kneeling beside her, her face pale with worry, her hands hovering over her. Celine, are you all right? What happened? Celine looked at her, her brow furrowed in confusion. Alara? She said, her voice hesitant. Yes, I'm fine. I think. She sat up, her head throbbing, her body aching. She looked around the clearing, her gaze searching for something.
Someone.
Where is he? She asked, her voice filled with a strange, unsettling anxiety. Alara looked confused. Who?
Who are you talking about?
Celine frowned, trying to remember, trying to grasp the fleeting image, the fading memory that was slipping away from her like sand through her fingers. A tall figure, dark hair, golden eyes. I don't know, she said, her voice filled with despair. I can't remember.
Nix.
The name echoed in the silent corners of her mind, a whisper of a memory, a ghost of a feeling. But the image, the emotion, the connection was gone.
Erased.
He was standing at the edge of the clearing, watching her, his form indistinct in the shadows, his golden eyes not golden. His eyes were brown, a warm, earthy brown, filled with a deep, unsettling sadness. He stepped forward, into the moonlight, and Celine saw him clearly for the first time. He was a man, tall and handsome, his features strong and kind, his hair dark, his eyes brown. He was a stranger. Are you all right? He asked, his voice gentle, concerned. Celine looked at him, her heart aching with a sense of loss, of longing, for something she couldn't remember, for someone she didn't know. I think so, she said, her voice trembling. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the lines of her face. His touch was familiar, comforting. You've been through a lot, he said. You need to rest. He helped her to her feet, his arms supporting her, his presence a silent, steadying force. They walked back to the cottage, Alara following close behind, her eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and concern. As they walked, Celine looked at the stranger, at his kind face, at his warm brown eyes. She felt a strange, unsettling attraction to him, a pull that defied logic, that transcended the emptiness in her heart. Who are you? She asked, her voice hesitant. He smiled, a sad, wistful smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. My name is Nathaniel, he said. And I am a friend. The pact was broken. The entity was free. Nyx was free. Free from the burden, from the sacrifice, from the slow, agonizing decline. But he was also free from her. From their love, from their shared past, from their bond. He had chosen to remain, to watch over her, to protect her from afar, in the shadows, in the silence. A guardian angel, a forgotten lover, a stranger who felt strangely familiar. The final embrace of a destiny neither had foreseen. The air around them seemed to hold its breath. What would happen now, with the pact broken and Celine's memory gone? What would become of Nathaniel, and would a new love ever blossom from the ashes of the old? Epilogue. Years passed. Celine and Alara remained in Blackwood Hollow, guardians of the forest, protectors of the peace that had been so dearly won. They rebuilt the Ashworth and Vance legacy, not as wielders of magic bound by a devouring pact, but as healers, as wise women, using their knowledge of herbs and the earth's energy to help those in need. Nathaniel became a familiar presence in their lives, a constant companion, a trusted friend. He helped them rebuild the cottage, tend the garden, care for the forest. He was a skilled craftsman, a gentle soul, a man who seemed to carry a deep, unspoken sadness within him, a sadness that mirrored the emptiness in Celine's heart. Celine never fully recovered her lost memories. The image of Nyx, the feeling of their love, the connection they had shared, remained a ghost, a whisper, a fleeting shadow that haunted her dreams. She would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, her heart aching with a sense of loss, of longing, for something she couldn't name, for someone she couldn't remember. She would often find herself drawn to the hidden grove, to the garden of lost souls, where the veil between worlds had once been so thin. She would sit by the pool, staring into its dark, still waters, searching for a reflection that wasn't there, for a memory that wouldn't surface. Nathaniel would often accompany her, sitting silently beside her, his presence a comfort, a silent understanding. He never questioned her, never pushed her to remember. He simply accepted her, with her emptiness, with her lost memories, with her lingering sadness. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the forest, Celine and Nathaniel were sitting by the pool in the Garden of Lost Souls. The air was calm and peaceful, the scent of pine and damp earth filling their senses. Celine looked at Nathaniel, at his kind face, at his warm brown eyes. She felt a deep affection for him, a gratitude for his presence in her life, for his unwavering support, for his silent understanding. "Nathaniel," she said, her voice soft, "thank you. For everything." He smiled, a sad, wistful smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You don't need to thank me, Celine," he said. "I am where I belong." He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the lines of her face. His touch was familiar, comforting. Suddenly, a flicker of memory, a spark of recognition, ignited within Celine's mind. She saw a flash of golden eyes, a glimpse of a scarred face, a whisper of a name, Nyx. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Nyx?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Nathaniel's smile faded, his brown eyes filling with a deep, profound sorrow. He nodded slowly. "Yes, Celine," he said, his voice a low, mournful whisper. "It is I." The memories came flooding back, a torrent of emotions, of experiences, of love, of loss, of sacrifice. She remembered everything. The pact, the entity, the ritual, the price she had paid. She remembered Nyx, her soulmate, her lover, her protector. She looked at Nathaniel, at his familiar face, at his brown eyes. She saw the truth, the painful, heartbreaking truth. He was Nyx, but not Nyx. He was the man he would have been, without the burden of the pact, without the centuries of suffering, without the slow, agonizing decline. He was free. And she was free, too. Free from the pact, free from the darkness, free to love again. But could she? Could she love this man, this stranger who was also her soulmate, this being who had sacrificed everything for her? Could she rebuild a love that had been shattered, erased, reborn in a different form? She reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. His hand was warm, strong, familiar. "Nyx," she said, her voice filled with a mixture of love, of loss, of hope. I remember." A single tear traced a path down his cheek, a tear of sorrow, of relief, of love. "And I," he said, his voice choked with emotion, "have always remembered." They sat there, by the pool, in the fading light, their hands clasped together, their hearts reunited, their souls connected once more. The past was gone, the future uncertain, but in that moment, in that embrace, they found peace, they found solace, they found love. A new love, born from the ashes of the old, a love that would endure, a love that would heal, a love that would last forever. The circle was complete.